Today, I'm going to show you how to make your drums extra thick and juicy with compression. Okay, so here we have those drums that you heard in the intro. Typically, I will record drums with compression, but I wanted to highlight in-the-box compression for this video, so I tracked these totally dry. I'm making sacrifices for you, my friends. So let's start off with the kick, and for this, we're going to be using an 1176. On a side note, if you're not familiar with any of the compressors I'm using in this video, be sure to go back and watch my video from last week on compression as a whole. And of course, you don't have to use these exact plugins or even Pro Tools, just work with what you got. Okay, so here in the 1176, I've got a pretty high ratio of 12:1. With kicks and snares, you really want every hit to be pretty equal, so don't be afraid to smash the crap out of them. You can see here that I'm getting about 7 decibels of gain reduction. Now listen to what happens if I make the release longer. As the release gets longer, the kick gets tighter and eventually pretty clicky. In some genres, like metal for instance, you might want a super clicky kick, but for this, I'd like a more beefy kick, so we're gonna leave this pretty fast. When you adjust the attack time, you'll hear the initial click of the kick starts to get a little softer. Super fast attack times are usually not ideal for drums. Everything will start to get a little mushy and lose that initial punch. So let's leave this one at about 2. All right, let's move on to the snare. We want to hit this pretty hard, but not necessarily as hard as the kick. I've set an 8:1 ratio with about 6 decibels of gain reduction. The same attack and release principles apply here. The slower the attack, the more punch you'll get, and the release will affect how much body the snare has. Listen to how the punch of the snare changes when we play with the attack. Now, listen to the overall shape of the snare as I play with the release. Pretty drastic, right? Definitely play with your attack and release settings, especially on the snare, and you can really dial in your settings and make that snare fat. All right, on to the overheads. I approach overheads a little differently than individual drums. In this case, the API 2500 is a good fit. An SSL bus compressor would also be a good choice, but the API is a little bit darker, and the symbols on this kit are Zildjian A customs, which are pretty bright, so we're going to tame that just a little bit with our compressor selection. The first thing you should do when you open up this particular compressor is turn off the freaking auto makeup gain. All of our makeup needs to be manual. Off. Moving on. We don't want to overcompress these mics. 3 to 5 decibels is usually fine. If we go too high, then you start to get pumping every time the kick and the snare hits, and the cymbals start to be all like... Starting at a 4:1 ratio is pretty safe. Sometimes you want to go lower and get a more gentle effect, and sometimes you can bump it up with 6 or 10. Just keep an eye on how much gain reduction you're getting. Now take a listen to how these drums get squashy when we start to crank this up. We want a slower attack and moderate to fast release for this. Since there is so much more going on here than with a single kick or snare, we need a bit faster release time so the compressor can keep up. So I'm going to slow this release way down. Pay attention to the sound of the snare and how it relates to the hi-hat. Also keep an eye on that meter. See how the compressor can't keep up when we slow it down like that? You're usually going to want a faster release time for overheads. So I'm going to play this back 2 more times, one with a fast release and one with a slow release. Just close your eyes and listen to the differences. Okay, now this is a fun one. This is our front of kit mic, or as I like to call it, the fuck. It's basically a room mic placed 10 feet away. In this case, it was a U87. So uncompressed, it sounds like this. But compressed, it sounds like this. Okay, the super secret squirrel stuff here is to push all of the buttons in on an 1176 at the same time. This can be done with both hardware and software 1176s. On a hardware unit, you kind of have to finagle the timing of how you push the buttons in to get them all to stick. You got to do it just right. On a plugin, you can simply hold shift and click the buttons. And you can tell things are getting pretty wonky because the VU meter just gets pinned and starts to behave really weirdly. So with all the buttons pushed in, the 1176 becomes a monster. We can just run the attack and release times as fast as they can go and let it turn our FOC mic into a complete sausage. And then just blend this with the rest of the kit for a healthy dose of beef. Here's what our drum mix sounds like without it. And here it is with that compressor. Just a little extra dose of beef. Now we move on to our final layer of compression, the entire drum bus. Compressing the entire drum bus really ties the room together.
It really tied the room together.
The SSL bus compressor is my go-to for this. There's like 500 versions of this compressor, and for good reason, because it's awesome. So we're going for a moderate amount of gain reduction on this, maybe just a few decibels, with a slow attack and a fast release, kind of like we had on the overheads. And we're just going to dial that mix back a little bit, and voila, one big fat unit. Now remember, don't take any of these settings as pure gospel. Experiment and find out what works best for the song. Maybe it needs a lot of compression, maybe it only needs a little bit. Just play around and figure out what works best for the song. Because in the end, with music, there are no rules. If you found value in this video, consider subscribing, drop a comment or a like. Have fun and be creative, and I'll see you in the next one.